They counted down the 7 most staggeringly preventable deaths, each one caused not by chance, but by catastrophic common-sense failure. They ranged from calculated stunts that became lethal to utter disregard for clear danger and expert warnings. The incidents demonstrated what happened when overconfidence and stubbornness overrode the survival instinct. The ranking exposed escalating levels of poor judgment, with every case leaving investigators and communities stunned at just how avoidable the outcome had been. Which fatal choice had been the most inexplicable of all? They began with number 7. On April 12, 2022, Marcus Hale, a 28-year-old software engineer, arrived at the Harding Plaza parking garage in Greenville, Ohio, with 3 friends and a single goal: to film a social media shopping cart stunt. Sober, physically healthy, and fully aware of his surroundings, Hale dismissed every warning. Security footage confirmed that he first walked the 46-meter concrete ramp, measuring its slope at 6.1 degrees. Friends cautioned him 3 separate times about the risk, including loss of control, fixed concrete barriers, and the potential for catastrophic injury. Each warning was captured on their phones, and each was ignored with a laugh. At 8:54 p.m., Hale climbed into the cart. The descent lasted less than 9 seconds. Speed analysis from closed-circuit television estimated that the cart reached 32.4 kilometers per hour at the base. Steering failed as the wheels began to wobble. The cart veered and struck the concrete barrier head-on. Deceleration at impact was calculated at 27 G, far beyond survivable limits for cranial tissue. Hale suffered a comminuted skull fracture, massive intracranial hemorrhage, and brainstem disruption. Paramedics arrived within 4 minutes, but resuscitation was not possible. Death was pronounced at 9:17 p.m. The investigation found no mechanical failure, no impairment, and no ambiguity. The death was 92% preventable. Forensic Review used this case to illustrate the lethal consequences of trivializing basic physics in pursuit of online attention. On September 9, 2021, Elaine Porter, age 34, arrived at Northbridge Rescue in Franklin, Pennsylvania. Porter worked as a veterinary technician, but she had no formal training in animal behavior or sanctuary protocols. She insisted on entering the enclosure of a 42-kilogram rescue dog with a documented history of aggression. Facility staff issued 4 direct warnings, each citing the dog's prior attacks and the facility's strict no-entry policy for non-handlers. Porter signed a waiver acknowledging the risks and the staff's refusal. Surveillance logs recorded her stating that all dogs just need love before she bypassed the locked gate. This entry was preventable. Within seconds of entry, the dog displayed classic predatory behaviors, including stiff posture, direct eye contact, and raised hackles. Porter ignored these signals and attempted to approach. The attack began with a bite to the right thigh, severing the femoral artery. Forensic bite pattern analysis identified a crushing force consistent with the dog's jaw strength, causing rapid arterial bleeding. Blood loss exceeded 1.4 liters in under 8 minutes. Staff activated the emergency response protocol, but by the time paramedics arrived at 11:05, Porter showed no signs of life. The official cause of death was exsanguination secondary to femoral artery transection. The investigation concluded that all sanctuary protocols were followed by staff. Porter's entry was deliberate, documented, and entirely deliberate and preventable. The facility trauma led to a review of visitor policies, but no charges were filed. The incident was cited in animal care training as a case study in the fatal consequences of rejecting expert authority and ignoring explicit animal warnings. At 10:41 p.m. on November 2, 2020, Harold Briggs, age 52, approached the closed span of County Road 14 in Addison, Vermont. Briggs, a postal carrier with no history of impairment, encountered a work zone marked by 5 distinct warnings: illuminated road closure signs, reflective cones, a flashing arrow board, double-layered barricades, and a physical gate spanning the roadway. Witnesses from the construction crew observed Briggs slow his sedan briefly, then steer left, weaving around the barricades at low speed. The vehicle accelerated to 54 kilometers per hour over 21 meters of exposed approach. No attempt was made to brake before the edge. The car launched off the truncated deck, traveling 9.8 meters vertically before impacting the rocky riverbed below. Event data recorder analysis confirmed a sustained throttle input and no steering correction in the final 3 seconds. The impact generated forces exceeding 45 G, consistent with catastrophic deceleration trauma. Autopsy identified multiple fractures of the skull, cervical spine, and thoracic cage, with laceration of the aorta and bilateral pulmonary contusions. Survival after such injuries was medically impossible. Submersion in 1.2 meters of water followed, but the cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma, not drowning. Time from launch to death was less than 1 minute. Toxicology screens were negative for alcohol, prescription drugs, or illicit substances. The investigation determined all warning infrastructure was fully operational and visible. Dashcam and site surveillance footage confirmed deliberate bypass of every barrier. No mechanical defects were found in the vehicle. Emergency responders cited this incident in subsequent training as a textbook example of a preventable infrastructure breach. The case was later referenced in regional safety campaigns as a demonstration of the fatal consequences when clear warnings were ignored by a fully competent adult. At 5:21 p.m. on July 18, 2019, Rafael Moreno, age 41, approached the Cedar crossing known to locals as X12. Moreno worked as a line cook at a nearby diner, and he used the tracks daily as a shortcut, despite the presence of a pedestrian overpass just 80 meters away. Surveillance logs and prior incident reports documented at least 3 previous near misses involving Moreno at this same site. The behavior was habitual. On that day, the crossing's automated gates lowered at 5:21 and 55 seconds p.m. Red lights flashed and bells sounded as a westbound freight train approached at a recorded speed of 106 kilometers per hour. 4 distinct warning systems were active. The gate arms, the bells, the flashing lights, and posted signage prohibiting crossing during activation. Eyewitnesses reported Moreno waiting on the far side of the tracks, glancing repeatedly between the oncoming train and the overpass. As the locomotive closed within 200 meters, Moreno stepped onto the ballast, ignoring shouts from 2 bystanders and the continuous alarm. Locomotive event data confirmed the engineer initiated emergency braking at 5:22 and 10 seconds p.m., but the train's mass, over 4,000 metric tons, rendered stopping impossible in the available distance. At 5:22 and 14 seconds p.m., the lead unit struck Moreno at full speed. The kinetic energy involved exceeded 1.6 million joules, resulting in instantaneous traumatic amputation of both lower limbs and massive blunt force injuries to the torso and head. Medical examiners documented catastrophic disruption of major vessels, with estimated exsanguination occurring within 30 seconds. Death was pronounced at 5:23 and 5 seconds p.m. Subsequent investigation confirmed all crossing warnings were fully operational and visible. Rail company records indicated prior crew complaints about a habitual crosser at X12, with camera footage from preceding weeks showing Moreno disregarding active signals on at least 6 occasions. The overpass, built in 2017, provided a safe alternative requiring less than 2 additional minutes of walking. Community response registered little surprise, with several residents citing repeated warnings and failed educational campaigns. Rail safety organizations used the incident to illustrate the fatal consequences of normalcy bias, where repeated rule-breaking created a false sense of safety until a single miscalculation proved lethal. On March 4, 2020, Thomas Albright, aged 47, entered his backyard in Lakeside, Michigan, to check the condition of his swimming pool after a late winter thaw. Albright worked as a landscaper and maintained detailed temperature logs for his property. The pool thermometer visible in his smartphone video recorded water at 2.1 degrees Celsius. Ice thickness measured at the edge was 6 millimeters, far below the 10 centimeters minimum recommended for even a single adult's weight. And the ice was unsafe. Neighbors separated by a wooden fence called out warnings as he stepped onto the ice. Audible in the background, one voice referenced last year's safety bulletin about backyard ponds. Albright ignored the warnings, shifted his weight forward, and narrated the creaks and flexing beneath his boots. The ice fractured under his right foot on the third step. He plunged into water at 2.1 degrees Celsius, immediately submerging up to his shoulders. The phone, still recording, captured his initial gasp, a hallmark of cold shock. Sudden immersion in near-freezing water triggered involuntary hyperventilation, a rapid heart rate, and loss of breath, hold control, often within seconds. Albright attempted to grip the pool edge, but his saturated clothing increased drag and reduced dexterity. The video showed repeated failed attempts to pull himself out. Within 1 minute, his speech became slurred and his movements slowed, a classic progression of hypothermia. In water below 5 degrees Celsius, muscle function deteriorated rapidly. The average adult lost effective use of the hands in under 2 minutes. By the third minute, Albright's attempts ceased. Drowning occurred within 6 minutes of immersion, consistent with cold incapacitation timelines documented in forensic literature. Emergency services arrived at 4:23 p.m., 12 minutes after the 911 call. Paramedics recorded a systole on initial assessment. Death was pronounced at the scene. Post-incident investigation referenced Albright's pool records, confirming the ice had not exceeded 8 millimeters at any point in the prior 72 hours. The case was cited in regional safety campaigns as a model of environmental misjudgment, preventable by adherence to basic ice thickness guidelines and recognition of cold water incapacitation risk. No mechanical failure, impairment, or underlying medical condition contributed. The fatal outcome was attributed solely to voluntary exposure to an obviously unstable environment, despite multiple warnings and objective danger signs. On December 30, 2018, Daniel Price, age 36, attended a holiday party at a colleague's home in Westfield, New Jersey. Price was a project manager with a history of office pranks and no record of substance use. Guests gathered near a staircase measuring 38 degrees in pitch, which terminated at a concrete-floored entryway. Multiple guests voiced concern about the plan to ride an office chair down the stairs. A standard four-wheeled swivel chair with plastic casters was positioned at the top step. Price dismissed warnings with a confident smile and announced he would keep perfect balance. At 10:42 p.m., he launched himself forward. The chair casters were designed for flat surfaces and failed to track straight on the angled treads. Within less than a second, the chair veered sideways, causing Price's upper body to pitch forward. The descent accelerated rapidly, gravity acting on the 38-degree slope, producing a calculated terminal velocity of 4.2 meters per second by the fifth step. The chair rear wheels caught on a tread and the chair flipped forward. Price's head and neck struck the edge of the landing wall with an estimated impact force exceeding 2,000 newtons. Immediate loss of consciousness was evident. Medical review of party footage and autopsy findings identified a comminuted fracture at the C3 and C4 vertebrae. The fracture produced a complete transection of the cervical spinal cord, eliminating all voluntary movement and respiratory drive below the injury site. Apnea occurred within seconds. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation was initiated by a guest, but without intact neural control of the diaphragm, effective ventilation was impossible. Paramedics arrived at 10:49 p.m. and pronounced death at 10:51 p.m. The recorded time from launch to fatal injury was under 4 seconds. The outcome was fatal and irreversible. Investigation confirmed Price was sober and that warnings were documented on video. The chair was inspected and found structurally sound, with no mechanical failure contributing to the event. A biomechanics consultant concluded that the axial load required to fracture the cervical spine in this manner was fully accounted for by the mass and velocity achieved on the staircase. The death was classified as 99.5% preventable. Corporate safety trainers now cite this case in presentations on the dangers of repurposing office equipment for stunts, noting that spinal cord injuries at the C3 to C4 level are universally fatal. The incident remained a textbook example of how group pressure and misplaced confidence overrode basic risk assessment, producing catastrophic and irreversible consequences. On August 14, 2017, Dr. Hannah Lee, age 44, prepared to extinguish a small fire in her Millbrook, Virginia backyard. Dr. Lee held a doctorate in chemistry and worked as a research scientist. The fire pit contained standard hardwood embers that remained actively burning. Within arm's reach stood a charged Class ABC fire extinguisher and a full 5-gallon water can. 4 family members present on the patio issued urgent warnings as Lee retrieved a 2-liter gasoline can from the garage, bypassing both safer options. Audio recordings captured Lee's rationale. She insisted gasoline would suffocate the flames by cutting off oxygen, a statement at odds with basic combustion gasoline chemistry. Gasoline vapor pressure at summer temperatures produced a dense, invisible cloud above the open container. As Lee approached the fire pit, vapor displaced the surrounding air. The ignition threshold for gasoline vapor in air, between 1.4% and 7.6% by volume, was easily reached as she tipped the can. The vapor ignited in less than 0.2 seconds, producing a flash fireball. Flames traveled upstream, engulfing Lee before any liquid gasoline contacted the coals. The blast wave knocked her backward, igniting clothing and exposed skin. Measured burn surface area reached 72% total body surface area, including full-thickness burns to the face, neck, chest, and upper limbs. Inhalation of superheated air caused immediate thermal injury to the upper airway and respiratory tract. Emergency services arrived within 7 minutes. Paramedics recorded extensive 2nd and 3rd degree burns, deep tissue charring, and rapid airway swelling. Lee was intubated at the scene and transported to the regional burn unit. Over the next 11 days, Lee underwent aggressive fluid resuscitation, multiple surgical debridements, and broad-spectrum antibiotics. Despite maximal supportive care, progressive respiratory failure developed, consistent with acute respiratory distress syndrome. Blood cultures documented sepsis by day 9. Multi-organ dysfunction followed. Death was pronounced on hospital day 11. Autopsy confirmed inhalation injury, extensive dermal loss, and systemic infection as contributing factors. Investigation by the fire marshal documented the presence of an unused extinguisher and water supply within 1 meter of the fire pit. Family testimony confirmed Lee's verbalized belief that gasoline would suppress, not intensify, the flames. No impairment or cognitive deficit was identified. The official report cited this as the most preventable fire death encountered by the department. The case was referenced in fire safety education as a catastrophic example of misapplied scientific reasoning and failure to respect flammable liquid hazards. No regulatory changes resulted. The incident remained a cautionary benchmark for both laypeople and professionals. The legacy was a stark demonstration that advanced education did not immunize against fatal ignorance of basic physical laws. Across all 7 deaths, one pattern stood out. Catastrophic overconfidence overrode even the most blatant warnings. Those cases proved that intelligence offered no immunity and that bad judgment could be terminal. In a world overflowing with safety systems and expert advice, human stubbornness remained the real hazard. The most preventable dangers were the ones people convinced themselves did not apply to them. Entitlement often felt like power, a shield against rules and consequences. When that illusion collided with reality, the result was not embarrassment, but catastrophe. The series examined 7 cases in which refusal to follow simple rules and repeated warnings ignored led to preventable deaths. The countdown began with number 7, where a refusal to wait in a mall led to a fatal escalator encounter. March 13, 2018. Linda Foster, 54, managed the women's apparel section at Crestview Mall in suburban Illinois. Known to staff for demanding immediate service and special accommodations, Linda's entitlement was visible in routine interactions. Employees described her as the type who would snap at cashiers, argue over return policies, and expect rules to bend for her. Her distinct platinum bob and sharp-heeled shoes became a warning sign for new hires, a cue to prepare for confrontation. That Tuesday, the central escalator was cordoned off for urgent repairs. Bright orange barriers, yellow tape, and a bold sign saying "Out of service, do not enter" blocked both entrances. Mall security stood by, redirecting shoppers to the stairs just 20 feet away. Linda arrived in a hurry, ignored the warnings, and demanded the escalator be reopened for her. Security explained repairs were underway and asked her to use the stairs. Witnesses recalled Linda raising her voice and insisting she didn't do stairs, that her time was too valuable to wait. Surveillance footage later confirmed she ducked under the barrier at 1:07 p.m., brushing past staff who tried to stop her. Within seconds, Linda's scarf caught in the exposed skirt step gap, just 4 millimeters wide, but enough to snag loose clothing. The escalator's mechanism, still powered for diagnostic testing, pulled the fabric and trapped her arm. Maintenance workers hit the emergency stop, but the entrapment was already severe. Paramedics arrived at 1:13 p.m. and attempted resuscitation, but Linda was pronounced dead at 1:27 p.m. from traumatic asphyxia and crush injuries. The Consumer Product Safety Commission's review cited her barrier breach as the direct cause, noting that 20% of escalator injuries involve entrapment and that proper lockout-tagout procedures had been followed by staff. The mall was cleared of liability, but new reinforced barriers were installed. For many, the tragedy was a grim reminder that sometimes the rules are all that stand between inconvenience and catastrophe. July 24, 2016. Patricia Wallace, 43, arrived at the Pinebrook Zoological Gardens just after noon, smartphone in hand, and 2 children trailing behind. Regular visitors knew her for frequent confrontations with staff about stroller restrictions and reserved picnic areas. Other parents described her as quick to challenge any rule she found inconvenient, often insisting that her family deserved special consideration. She wore a designer sun hat and carried a monogrammed tote, and her voice carried across the entry plaza as she demanded directions to the big cat exhibit. The lion enclosure was protected by a 6-foot primary fence and a 3-foot secondary barrier, both topped with warning signs that read, "Do not cross, dangerous animals." That afternoon, a professional photographer was stationed nearby offering souvenir photos for guests. Patricia dismissed the service, waved off the photographer, and told her children she could get a better shot herself. 3 separate times, zookeepers instructed her to remain behind the barrier, pointing out the posted guidelines and reminding her of the risks. Phone footage from a bystander later confirmed that Patricia ignored these warnings and stepped over the low fence while her children watched. Witnesses later recalled Patricia brushing off staff concerns, calling the rules overkill and saying she knew what she was doing. As she positioned herself for a selfie at the fence, a juvenile lioness was startled by the sudden movement and lunged toward the barrier. Patricia lost her balance and tumbled into the restricted area. The animal closed the distance in seconds. Keeper alarms sounded, and staff rushed to intervene, but the lioness made contact and caused catastrophic trauma. Emergency responders arrived within 4 minutes. Paramedics documented severe injuries on arrival and provided advanced life support on scene. Despite those efforts, Patricia was pronounced dead at the scene from massive hemorrhage and multiple penetrating wounds. The medical examiner recorded the cause of death as blunt and sharp force trauma consistent with an animal attack and noted the rapid progression from injury to fatal blood loss. The zoo's internal review identified Patricia's unauthorized entry and disregard for repeated warnings as the direct cause of the incident. The facility installed higher barriers and increased staff patrols, but no national regulations changed. Among staff and regular visitors, the response was subdued, many pointing to the clear signage and the multiple attempts to stop her. For those who witnessed the event, the lesson was clear and preventable. In a place where wild animals lived, the rules were not suggestions. August 12, 2019, Melissa Grant, 34, entered Sunridge Amusement Park in Central Ohio. Her impatience was already apparent as she joined the line for the cyclone. Colleagues later described her as someone who routinely ignored safety protocols and dismissed instructions she found inconvenient. That afternoon, she argued with staff and demanded faster boarding, drawing attention to herself before even reaching the ride platform. The Cyclone's lap bars, built to ASTM F24 standards, were engineered to withstand 1,200 newtons, far more than a person could overcome unaided. Operators followed a strict checklist and confirmed every restraint by hand and eye before dispatch. Assigned the front row, Melissa interrupted the operator's instructions, insisting her lap bar was too tight. When told it could not be adjusted, she rolled her eyes and muttered about unnecessary rules. The operator, a 17-year-old seasonal worker, documented her refusal in the ride log and issued 2 warnings before starting the cycle. Staff later described her pattern of demanding special treatment and difficulty with authority. CCTV footage later revealed that Melissa deliberately unlatched her restraint as the train crested the 110-foot apex at 37 miles per hour. Operators and witnesses shouted warnings, and the operator engaged emergency procedures as soon as the ejection occurred. Witnesses described chaos and screaming, and staff recalled a string of prior incidents where she ignored explicit warnings from ride personnel. But as the coaster plunged, G-forces peaked at 3.8 times the force of gravity. Melissa braced herself with her arms, but within seconds, she was ejected from her seat, tumbling over the side of the car. The coaster's momentum and the height of the drop produced a rapid sequence of forces that resulted in blunt impact against structural elements. Witnesses described a fraction of a second between ejection and the train's halt, and the operator immediately followed emergency shutdown and rescue protocols. Medical teams arrived within 4 minutes. Paramedics found Melissa unresponsive with injuries consistent with fatal blunt force trauma. Emergency responders performed advanced life support measures, including airway management and chest compressions, but she showed no meaningful response. She was pronounced dead at 2:46 in the afternoon. The coroner's report cited multiple fractures and internal injuries as the cause of death. State regulators cleared the operator and the park, citing Melissa's refusal to follow safety instructions as the direct cause. The incident prompted a new state law that required electronic restraint sensors and operator override locks on all rides. Among staff, the message was clear: safety rules exist for a reason, and physics is not negotiable. September 28, 2020. Brenda McAllister, 62, was running late for a property showing on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge. As a real estate agent with a reputation for impatience, Brenda often treated traffic laws as obstacles to her schedule. Colleagues described her as someone who would double park in fire lanes, roll through stop signs, and argue with meter attendants. Her silver sedan and signature oversized sunglasses were well known around town. Neighbors recalled heated exchanges over street parking, while former clients remembered her as always in a hurry, rules be damned. The intersection at County Road 14 and Maple Avenue featured dual crossing gates, flashing red lights, and a warning bell system. The National Transportation Safety Board reported the gates automatically lowered 24 seconds before a train's arrival, leaving ample time for vehicles to clear the tracks. On that Monday, a 7,500-ton freight train was approaching at 55 miles per hour. Crossing cameras captured Brenda's car idling at the front of the line as the gates descended and the bells sounded. Phone records later confirmed she was on a call, discussing an upcoming open house. Witnesses said Brenda glanced at her watch, then steered around the lowered gate with one hand on the wheel and the other holding her phone. The train's horn blasted repeatedly, but her windows were up. In the final seconds, the locomotive engineer engaged the emergency brakes, but a freight train at that speed required over a mile to stop. The impact occurred at 3:12 in the afternoon, crushing the car and scattering debris across both tracks. Emergency crews arrived within 7 minutes. Brenda was pronounced dead at the scene from massive blunt force trauma. The official investigation cited driver error and distraction as the sole causes. The railroad was cleared of responsibility. The crossing had functioned as designed. In response, county officials installed additional barriers and upgraded camera systems. Among local residents, the tragedy inspired little sympathy, with many pointing to Brenda's well-known disregard for the rules. The lesson repeated in public safety campaigns was clear. No schedule was worth outpacing a freight train. June 30th, 2021. Cynthia Rowe, age 41, was well known in Lakewood for her extravagant block parties and for her refusal to follow city rules. She had developed a reputation for pushing boundaries, organizing unpermitted street events, ignoring curfews, and dismissing safety warnings as unnecessary. City records showed 3 previous citations for unauthorized fireworks at her gatherings. One neighbor summed her up, she thought the rules didn't apply to her. That year's 4th of July celebration was set for the local soccer field, bordered by homes and dry grass. Cynthia applied for a fireworks permit, but was denied because she lacked NFPA certification and because officials were concerned about how she stored explosives. The city offered to help her hire licensed professionals at a discount, but Cynthia refused. She arrived early, unloading commercial shells and cardboard mortars from her SUV. Witnesses said she brushed off the fire marshal's warnings, insisting, "I've done this before. It's perfectly safe." NFPA standards required at least 70 feet of separation for every inch of shell diameter. That requirement meant 210 feet for the 3-inch shells Cynthia brought. Instead of meeting that separation, and instead of using steel containment, she set up launch tubes just 40 feet from the crowd and kept the shells in a plastic bin next to the firing area. The fire marshal warned her again that she must stop or face a fine. Cynthia waved him off, telling him he was trying to ruin the fun. Multiple warnings were ignored, and witnesses later described a pattern of escalation. Neighbors recalled that she dismissed expert advice and repeated that she knew what she was doing. Staff and the fire marshal attempted to intervene, but Cynthia pushed back, insisting the display proceed as planned. Her refusal to comply removed layers of safety that existed to protect attendees. As dusk fell, Cynthia lit the first shell with a barbecue lighter. The mortar tube was angled incorrectly. The shell failed to launch and detonated at ground level after only 2.6 seconds. The explosion scattered burning debris and chemical residues, setting Cynthia's clothes on fire and causing other shells in the plastic bin to rupture. The crowd panicked. Some people tried to smother flames with bottled water, while others called 911. Witnesses described terror as embers and shrapnel rained into the audience. Paramedics arrived on scene at 9:18 p.m. Cynthia suffered third-degree burns over 80% of her body, and she had inhaled toxic combustion smoke. Emergency responders began advanced airway management and fluid resuscitation on scene, and she was transported to a regional burn center for surgical evaluation. She died at 3:40 a.m. The city's investigation cataloged multiple violations of NFPA 1123 and NFPA 1126, related to separation distances, storage, and handling of commercial shells. In response, officials passed an ordinance requiring all public fireworks displays to be conducted by licensed professionals. Cynthia's death became a stark, unavoidable reminder of why those standards exist. October 15, 2022. Diane Caldwell, age 52, arrived at Midtown Plaza just after 4 p.m., her Lexus SUV pausing in the main lane with hazard lights flashing. Store managers recognized her. Diane had a reputation for heated disputes over parking, with 3 prior complaints logged in the past year. She wore a crisp blazer and sunglasses, her stance rigid as she scanned the crowded lot. Midtown Plaza's lot was marked for two-way traffic and lined with mirrored security domes. That afternoon, a white sedan signaled for a space as a shopper pulled out. Diane accelerated, blocking the spot. The sedan's driver, a 28-year-old teacher, slowed, dashcam running, as Diane stepped out and planted herself in front of the car, arms folded. Bystanders urged her to step aside. The teacher, window down, calmly explained she had the right of way. Diane argued, raising her voice and threatening to call mall security. Security video, time-stamped 16:07:13, captured Diane pacing in front of the sedan, gesturing sharply. The sedan idled at 6 miles per hour, brake lights on. After nearly a minute, the driver edged forward, trying to maneuver around. Diane stepped directly into the car's path. At 6 miles per hour, the sedan generated 2.7 kilojoules of kinetic energy. Dashcam audio measured the driver's reaction time at 0.8 seconds. When Diane refused to yield, the car clipped her knee. She lost balance, fell backward, and struck her head on the pavement. Shoppers gasped. The driver stopped at once and called 911. Paramedics arrived within 5 minutes. Diane was unresponsive, with no pulse. She was pronounced dead at 4:18 p.m., the cause listed as blunt force trauma and basal skull fracture. Police reviewed security and dashcam footage, confirming the driver's actions were within legal limits. Investigators found Diane's sudden movement left no time to avoid the collision. The incident drew national attention, sparking debate over pedestrian aggression and parking lot safety. Mall management widened lanes, added bollards, and increased patrols. Among staff, sympathy was limited, and many cited Diane's pattern of confrontational behavior. Investigators concluded the death was preventable had standard parking protocols been followed. December 11, 2022. Sharon Reed, 53, boarded Flight 804 from Denver to Atlanta, her business suit pressed and carry-on stowed with practiced precision. Colleagues had known her as a high-powered consultant who brooked no delay, quick to escalate minor inconveniences to management and unafraid to challenge airline staff. Gate agents remembered heated disputes over seat assignments and priority boarding, and she often insisted her status entitled her to special treatment. On this flight, she was assigned a middle seat in row 18 after a last-minute equipment swap. Witnesses described her as visibly agitated, pacing the aisle and demanding to be reseated, her voice carrying above the pre-flight announcements. The aircraft, a Boeing 737-900, reached cruising altitude, 34,000 feet, with a cabin pressure differential of 8 pounds per square inch that held the fuselage sealed tight. FAA regulations required flight attendants to brief passengers on emergency procedures and to monitor cabin behavior, especially after takeoff. Sharon flagged down the lead attendant, insisting her seat was unacceptable and demanding an immediate upgrade. When told there were no available seats, she grew louder and threatened that she would get off right now. Flight attendants issued multiple warnings, explaining both policy and the physical impossibility of opening the emergency exit at altitude. Passengers in nearby rows later recalled Sharon's repeated outbursts and her refusal to comply with crew instructions. The situation escalated as she unbuckled her belt and lunged toward the overwing exit. Despite the warnings, Sharon gripped the exit handle and declared she would open the door and leave if her demands were not met. The cabin alarm triggered as she tampered with the mechanism, though at 34,000 feet the door could not be opened because of the pressure difference. Crew followed FAA protocols, signaling the cockpit and summoning the air marshal on board. As the marshal and two attendants moved to restrain her, Sharon resisted, flailing and shouting. A passenger's smartwatch, later submitted to investigators, recorded her heart rate peaking at 190 beats per minute. The physical struggle and extreme stress triggered a cardiac arrhythmia. Within moments, Sharon lost consciousness. The crew initiated cardiopulmonary resuscitation and used the onboard automated external defibrillator while the pilot diverted to St. Louis. Emergency medical teams boarded at 2:18 p.m., but resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful. Sharon was pronounced dead at 2:29 p.m. The coroner's report cited sudden cardiac death secondary to ventricular fibrillation, exacerbated by acute emotional stress. Medical findings described an arrhythmic collapse precipitated by extreme sympathetic activation during the struggle. FAA investigators reviewed the incident and cited Sharon's repeated non-compliance and physical aggression as the direct cause of the emergency. Data from 2022 showed FAA fines for unruly passenger behavior exceeding $52,000 per incident, with a marked increase in in-flight disruptions since the pandemic. The airline introduced enhanced de-escalation training and support protocols for crew, while federal policy changes mandated stricter passenger screening and reinforced legal consequences for air rage. Industry analysts pointed to the case as a turning point, prompting a nationwide overhaul of unruly passenger enforcement. Public reaction was swift, with many travelers expressing frustration over rising in-flight incidents and offering limited sympathy for Sharon's actions. Commentators noted the irony that a dispute over a middle seat and a first-class upgrade that had been offered earlier had escalated into a fatal medical emergency. In the end, the rules that kept a pressurized cabin safe proved non-negotiable, no matter how loudly they were challenged. Across all 7 entries, one pattern stood out. Extreme entitlement could override common sense and turn minor inconveniences into fatal outcomes. These cases proved that arrogance is not just annoying, it is dangerous. In a world built on shared rules, ignoring boundaries had real, irreversible costs. The lesson is simple: reality always wins. If you want more shocking true life rankings, hit subscribe and join us for the next countdown. We are counting down the 7 most shockingly preventable deaths ever documented, where everyday people met their end through decisions that defy logic and basic self-preservation. These cases range from status-driven stunts and technical overconfidence to ignored medical warnings and breathtaking stubbornness. Each case earned its place for sheer avoidability and for the detailed investigative proof that followed. Which fatal misjudgment tops the list as history's ultimate cautionary tale? Let us begin our ranking with number 7. On October 25, 2018, Vishnu Viswanath, a 29-year-old software engineer, and Meenakshi Murthy, a 30-year-old travel blogger, arrived at Yosemite's Taft Point. Both had sizable online followings, sharing photos from extreme locations with thousands of followers. That evening, they climbed over a waist-high guardrail that was clearly marked with warning signs that read, "Stay back from cliff edge." Witnesses, just 20 feet away, shouted for them to stop, but the couple focused on setting up their camera for another daring selfie. At 6:32 p.m., their final photo was posted. Minutes later, the granite ledge beneath them crumbled. Both fell nearly 800 feet to the valley floor below. The coroner's report listed multiple blunt force injuries, skull fractures, thoracic collapse, and aortic rupture. Death was likely instantaneous. Rangers received a 911 call at 6:43 p.m. By 6:56 p.m., both were pronounced dead. Toxicology reports confirmed neither was impaired. The National Park Service investigation concluded the deaths were entirely preventable, citing 3 ignored warnings and a deliberate barrier bypass. In response, Yosemite increased signage and ranger patrols at cliff edges, underscoring the tragic cost of chasing online attention at the expense of basic safety. On May 7, 2011, Dr. Mark Glover, a 46-year-old pediatrician in Plano, Texas, began a home renovation that should have stopped at the first warning sign. His plan was to rewire the original 220-volt breaker panel to install new recessed lighting. 2 previous attempts by licensed professionals had failed city inspection, and permit office records contained written warnings against do-it-yourself work on that specific panel. Despite those warnings, Dr. Glover pressed ahead and left the main power supply live. Family text messages from that afternoon show his wife pleaded with him to wait for an electrician, noting the breaker was tricky. At 4:12 in the afternoon, he sent his last outgoing text. Minutes later, working barehanded, he misidentified a neutral wire and made contact with a live conductor while bracing himself against a grounded pipe. The resulting arc flash ignited his shirt and produced full-thickness burns to his hands, arms, and chest. His son heard a loud pop and found him collapsed at 4:18 in the afternoon. Paramedics recorded ventricular fibrillation on arrival and pronounced death at 4:32 in the afternoon. The city investigation cited ongoing code violations, and investigators documented unused insulated gloves found beside the panel. Their conclusion was clear. The fatality was entirely preventable. Insurance denied the claim, citing regulatory noncompliance and gross negligence. Local ordinances were amended to require permits for all residential electrical work on panels manufactured before 1980, a direct response to the tragedy. On July 17, 2016, Natasha Ednan Laperouse, a 15-year-old student with a well-documented sesame allergy, was preparing to board a flight at Heathrow Airport. Years of careful management had shaped her daily life. Her family carried epinephrine auto-injectors everywhere, and she was known to check food labels with vigilance. That afternoon, Natasha purchased an artisan baguette from a pret-a-manger outlet in Terminal 5. The packaging displayed no allergen warning for sesame, and the ingredient list omitted any mention of it. Her father, standing beside her, double-checked the label and voiced concern, but Natasha, eager not to draw attention or delay her friends, dismissed his worry and began eating. Within 12 minutes, urticaria appeared along her throat and arms. She told her father she felt unwell as they boarded their British Airways flight to Nice. The reaction escalated rapidly. Her breathing became labored, and her pulse became erratic. At 12:07 p.m., her father administered the first of 2 epinephrine injectors. Cabin crew called for a doctor on board, and a second injection followed as Natasha's airway began to swell. Despite these efforts, her condition deteriorated. She went into cardiac arrest at 12:32 p.m., just as the plane made an emergency descent. Paramedics met the aircraft on the tarmac, but after 44 minutes of resuscitation attempts, Natasha was pronounced dead at 1:16 p.m. The coroner's inquest revealed that sesame seeds had been baked into the bread, invisible to the eye and unlisted on the packaging. Testimony confirmed Natasha's family had previously alerted the company to her allergy, and pret-a-manger had received multiple warnings about similar incidents. The coroner's official finding was blunt. Natasha's death was entirely avoidable. In the aftermath, public outrage grew. Her parents' campaign led to the passage of Natasha's Law in 2021, which now requires all prepackaged foods sold in the United Kingdom to display full ingredient and allergen information. Natasha's name became synonymous with the high cost of incomplete labeling and the perils of dismissing known medical risks, forever altering food safety standards across the country. On June 18, 2009, Leandro dos Santos de Oliveira, a 23-year-old visitor to the São Paulo Zoo, made a decision that turned a routine family outing into a textbook case of fatal hubris. Leandro had no animal handling credentials, but by all accounts, he was a healthy, capable adult, accompanied that afternoon by his mother and a young child. This was an ordinary family visit until one choice changed everything. Fatal error in judgment. The Bengal tiger enclosure was secured by a 1-meter metal fence, a setback rail, and a 4-meter wide dry moat. Multiple warning signs in Portuguese were posted along the perimeter. The signs read, "Perigo, Não ultrapasse." Zoo staff had inspected the area earlier that morning. All barriers and signage were in place. Clear warnings surrounded the exhibit. Leandro ignored both physical and verbal warnings. In full view of his family and a growing crowd, he climbed over the first fence, vaulted the secondary rail, and descended into the restricted moat area. Witnesses, including his mother, shouted at him to stop. A zoo attendant began running toward the enclosure, but the breach and approach happened in seconds. Leandro gestured and called out, trying to attract the attention of Moham, the adult male Bengal tiger on display that day. Confidence misplaced. The tiger responded as a top predator. As Leandro reached the inner mesh, Moham lunged, seizing the man's right arm with his jaws and dragging him against the cage. The bite severed the brachial artery and inflicted deep lacerations to the chest and neck. Bystanders reported a rapid collapse. Loss of consciousness followed within 30 seconds as blood poured from the wound. Zoo medics arrived within 2 minutes, but the volume of blood loss made resuscitation impossible. Leandro was pronounced dead at the scene at 1:03 p.m. The autopsy later confirmed acute hemorrhagic shock as the cause of death, with injuries incompatible with survival, even under optimal emergency care. Hemorrhagic shock stated on the report. Security footage reviewed by São Paulo police confirmed the incident unfolded in less than 2 minutes, from barrier breach to fatal injury. The zoo's internal investigation found that safety protocols had been observed. In response, management added more multilingual signage and increased patrols around big cat enclosures. The case is now used in safety seminars worldwide as a stark reminder. No amount of bravado can outmatch the laws of nature, and the consequence of ignoring 3 layers of explicit warning is tragically preventable. On March 30, 2017, Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut, hosted a charity pancake eating contest. Caitlin Nelson, a 20-year-old psychology major and well-liked sorority member, joined the event to outdo a friend's record. She was known for her outgoing personality and her enthusiasm for campus causes, but also for having struggled with rapid eating in the past. The contest rules were clear. Chew thoroughly, do not rush, and emergency medical technicians were stationed nearby in case of trouble. Friends and family in the crowd reminded her to take it slow, but the energy in the room pushed competitors to eat quickly for the win. The pressure and bravado in the room were palpable. At 8:44 p.m., the contest began. In less than 90 seconds, Caitlin had eaten several pancakes. Suddenly, she clutched her throat and collapsed forward, unable to breathe. Paramedics responded within 3 minutes and found a complete airway blockage, a dense bolus of pancake lodged in her upper trachea. Initial Heimlich maneuvers failed to dislodge the obstruction. At 8:56 p.m., she was intubated on scene, but her brain had already gone without oxygen for nearly 10 minutes. The airway obstruction was total and immediate. Caitlin was transported to St. Vincent's Medical Center, where she remained on life support. Despite aggressive intervention, the lack of oxygen had caused irreversible hypoxic brain injury. At 3:13 p.m. the next day, she was pronounced dead. The coroner's report confirmed mechanical asphyxiation due to food bolus obstruction, with no evidence of underlying medical conditions or intoxication. The clinical findings were clear and irreversible. Witness statements and event footage documented that multiple warnings about choking risk were given before the contest began. The university's own risk assessment had flagged the event as low risk due to the presence of emergency medical technicians and the routine nature of pancake eating contests. Yet the official investigation found that the speed and volume of consumption overwhelmed even the best on-site response. The tragedy was entirely preventable in hindsight. Lawsuits filed by Nelson's family argued that university oversight was insufficient, pointing to a lack of clear emergency protocols for airway obstruction and inadequate participant screening. In the aftermath, Sacred Heart University suspended all eating competitions. The case ignited national debate over the safety of food-based dares and the pressure to perform in group settings. Event policies were rewritten and other institutions took notice, many instituting stricter rules or outright bans. The response was immediate and suspended activity became common. Caitlin Nelson's death stands as a stark example of how peer-driven bravado, even with professional supervision and explicit warnings, can override basic caution with consequences that unfold in minutes but last forever. The lesson is tragic and simple. Some dares are lethal, and warnings matter. August 28, 2005. John McGovern, a 51-year-old attorney and lifelong New Orleans resident, spent that Sunday morning fielding calls from friends and relatives urging him to evacuate. He had the means: a fully fueled SUV, a credit card, and a standing invitation from family in Baton Rouge. But McGovern, known for his stubborn streak and belief in self-reliance, saw Hurricane Katrina as just another storm to ride out. 7 separate evacuation alerts had reached his home in the preceding 48 hours. Citywide robocalls, NOAA weather radio warnings, and 2 in-person visits from Orleans Parish deputies. Each time, McGovern waved them off. His social media posts from that weekend showed a mix of bravado and denial. He posted on August 28th at 7:02 p.m. that they always ride these out, and that he was not leaving his house to the looters. By midnight, the National Weather Service had escalated its language, warning of devastating flooding and loss of life likely. Mandatory evacuation orders were in effect for all of New Orleans. McGovern remained. At 8:14 a.m. on August 29, 2005, the levee protecting his neighborhood failed. Within minutes, floodwaters surged through the lower floor of his home. McGovern retreated upstairs, posting at 8:35 a.m. that he was fine and going to wait it out. The next warning came not from officials, but from the groan of shifting timbers. At 8:41 a.m., the roof above McGovern's attic collapsed under the force of rising water and debris. The autopsy later listed acute drowning as the primary cause of death, with secondary blunt force trauma from the collapse. Rescue teams, overwhelmed by citywide devastation, did not reach the address until September 1, 2005. McGovern's body was found in the debris, identified by his wallet and watch. No CPR was attempted. Advanced post-mortem changes confirmed death had occurred days earlier. FEMA and Orleans Parish records documented every warning delivered. The official investigation cited complete compliance failure, noting that McGovern had both the resources and the information to escape. Toxicology screens ruled out impairment. In the aftermath, New Orleans increased fines for non-compliance with evacuation orders, and McGovern's name became shorthand among emergency planners for the cost of ignoring the obvious. His case stands as a stark reminder: no amount of personal resolve can outlast the laws of nature or the rising water. July 9, 1993. Toronto's financial district was winding down for the evening when Gary Hoy, a 38-year-old senior partner at the prestigious law firm Holden Day Wilson, gathered a group of summer interns for a demonstration he had performed before. Hoy was respected, and the room expected a controlled show of confidence. Hoy was no fool. He held dual credentials as both a lawyer and a trained engineer, with a reputation for precision and attention to detail. He prided himself on knowing the building's specifications, especially the glass windows that lined the 24th floor of the Toronto Dominion Centre. At 7:22 p.m., in front of more than a dozen colleagues, Hoy announced his intention to prove the strength of the office windows. Several co-workers, already aware of his penchant for this unusual stunt, urged him to reconsider. One recalled saying, "You will go through that glass if you keep doing that." Hoy brushed off the warnings, insisting the glass was unbreakable and that he had done it before. He took a running start and hurled himself shoulder first against the window pane. The glass flexed under his weight but held, as it was engineered to do. Laughter and nervous glances filled the boardroom. Hoy, emboldened by the result and determined to impress the room, prepared for a second attempt. The digital clock on the wall read 7:24 p.m. as he launched himself again, this time with even greater force. The glass did not shatter. Instead, the entire window assembly, pane and frame, popped cleanly out of its track, exactly as designed under abnormal stress. The sudden release offered no resistance. Hoy plunged 24 stories, approximately 300 feet, before striking the concrete courtyard below. The impact caused catastrophic injuries, aortic rupture, multiple compound fractures, and fatal cranial trauma. Emergency medical services arrived at 7:31 p.m. and pronounced him dead at 7:33 p.m. The coroner's investigation found no evidence of intoxication or mental impairment. The window itself met all building codes. The failure lay in the frame, which was specifically engineered to detach rather than shatter under extreme force. That design feature was meant to prevent glass shards from raining down on pedestrians, not to withstand repeated human impacts. The official report concluded that compliance with posted safety measures would have prevented this death with near certainty. Hoy's colleagues described the aftermath as surreal. The law firm immediately banned all live demonstrations of building features. Building managers ordered a review of all window frames in high-rise offices across Toronto. In occupational safety training circles, Hoy's death became a textbook example of how expertise in one domain does not guarantee sound judgment in another. The incident is now referenced worldwide as the ultimate cautionary tale, a highly intelligent, sober professional surrounded by explicit warnings and peer objections, choosing to test a physical limit that no reasonable person would challenge. The legacy of Gary Hoy's fatal leap endures in legal and engineering seminars and in policies that now forbid such demonstrations, ensuring that one man's catastrophic miscalculation is never repeated. Across all 7 cases, one pattern stands out. Fatal outcomes often follow not ignorance, but willful disregard for obvious danger. Intelligence or skill offers no immunity when confidence overrides caution. These deaths remind us that common sense is a life-saving tool, ignored at our peril. In a world obsessed with risk and spectacle, the real threat is forgetting that some lines are drawn for a reason. It was a list of 7 of the most incomprehensibly preventable deaths ever recorded, instances where catastrophic lapses in basic judgment produced fatal outcomes. Each case involved capable, otherwise functional adults who ignored obvious risks, dismissed multiple warnings, and made choices that any reasonable observer would have recognized as deadly. These were not accidents or acts of fate, but a clinical demonstration of natural selection by reckless choice, with each entry escalating the sheer absurdity of the decision. The countdown began at number 7, and every case that followed would prove how basic common sense could literally save a life. It was July 4th, 2021, when Caleb R. Morton, age 34, arrived at a backyard gathering in Tulsa, Oklahoma, carrying a homemade helmet rigged with consumer-grade fireworks. Morton was a sober, fully employed tradesman, described by friends as practical, confident, and demonstrably overconfident that afternoon. He spent hours explaining his plan to several guests, stating he would strap Roman candles and bottle rockets to his head for a so-called patriotic grand finale. 3 separate guests voiced concern, and some recorded their warnings on mobile phones. The fireworks packaging displayed warning labels that explicitly stated, "Do not attach to body and risk of severe injury or death." Morton dismissed every objection, insisting he had calculated the risks and that it would be hilarious. But as dusk settled and the crowd pressed record, Morton knelt in the grass, donned the helmet, and handed a lighter to a friend. The ignition sequence produced an immediate malfunction. A Roman candle intended to fire skyward rotated on its mount and discharged directly against the left temporal region of the skull. The projectile energy and thermal output produced catastrophic cranial trauma, with focal thermal burns and blunt force impact occurring at point-blank range. Loss of consciousness was immediate. Emergency medical services were on scene within 4 minutes, but Morton was pronounced dead at the scene from massive brain injury and thermal burns. The post-incident investigation documented 3 separate bystander attempts to intervene and multiple video recordings of warnings that were ignored. The coroner described the death as entirely preventable, noting no mitigating medical conditions and no substances involved. Friends and family expressed disbelief, citing Morton's otherwise practical nature and stable employment. The case was recorded as a clear example of fatal bravado overwhelming basic judgment, and of multiple preventable exit ramps that were not taken. It was May 3, 2019, when Monica L. Reyes, age 41, entered the break room of her office building in Phoenix, Arizona. Reyes was a project manager, known for impatience and a short temper, and she was fully functional and sober at the time. Her behavior that afternoon would be judged as a deliberate and avoidable choice. Reyes had just lost $2 to a vending machine. The unit stood against the wall, weighing 780 pounds. A bright red sticker at eye level read, "Do not rock or tip. Risk of injury or death." The warning was visible to everyone in the room. 3 co-workers were present as Reyes pressed the selection panel repeatedly, then began shaking the machine. One colleague warned her about the posted instructions. Reyes dismissed the warning, muttering that the machine deserved it. Her frustration escalated. Reyes wedged her foot beneath the base of the machine and pulled forward, ignoring another shouted warning. The heavy unit began to teeter, the center of gravity shifting with each forceful tug. At 3:14 p.m., the vending machine tipped forward, pinning Reyes's torso and pelvis to the linoleum floor. The impact produced catastrophic thoracic compression. The chest cavity was compressed, lung expansion was restricted, and venous return to the heart was impaired. She remained conscious for 2 minutes, gasping for air, while co-workers attempted to lift the machine. Emergency medical services were summoned and arrived at 3:20 p.m. By 3:20 p.m., irreversible positional asphyxia had occurred. Cardiopulmonary arrest ensued. Death was pronounced at 3:21 p.m., 6 minutes after entrapment. The injuries were described clinically as compressive thoracic trauma leading to respiratory failure and circulatory collapse. Surveillance footage later confirmed the sequence of events: repeated rocking attempts, clear signage, and audible warnings from bystanders. The workplace investigation cited Reyes's deliberate disregard for posted safety instructions and for co-worker interventions. No equipment malfunction was found. As a result, building management anchored all vending machines and reinforced safety signage. Staff expressed disbelief, emphasizing that the warnings were impossible to miss. The case became a referenced example in safety seminars, a textbook instance of lethal impatience overwhelming common sense. It was August 12, 2020 when Jordan M. Hales, 27 years old, arrived at the North Shore Residences in downtown Chicago with a GoPro, a tripod, and a plan to livestream what he called the ultimate urban thrill. Hales was a sober social media influencer, college-educated, with steady sponsorship income and a documented appetite for online risk-taking. Security logs later showed him entering the service corridor at 2:38 p.m., bypassing a locked access panel using a borrowed maintenance key. Building cameras captured him disabling the car top safety switch, wedging open the shaft door, and ignoring the illuminated warning that read, "Danger, moving equipment." Friends watching the stream texted warnings and urged him to stop. One friend called his phone 3 times, leaving voicemails describing the risks. Hales responded on camera, brushing off concerns and promising that nothing would go wrong. At 2:44 p.m., he climbed onto the elevator car roof, crouched beside the machinery, and signaled his remote operator to send the car to the penthouse level. 4 separate engineered safeguards had been defeated in under 6 minutes. But as the elevator began its ascent, Hales misjudged the clearance above. At 2:45 p.m., the car reached the 14th floor, and his head struck a crossbeam at a speed calculated at 4.2 feet per second. An immediate cranial fracture and cervical spine trauma were sustained, rendering him unconscious. The elevator continued upward, and his body became wedged between the car and the shaft wall before the emergency stop engaged. Emergency services arrived at 2:57 p.m., and death was pronounced at the scene. The medical examiner cited catastrophic blunt force trauma with instantaneous loss of vital signs. Investigators reviewed security footage and digital logs, confirming that Hales had methodically bypassed 4 independent safety systems. The building's elevator contractor stated that all safeguards had functioned as designed and that each had been deliberately overridden. The incident prompted no regulatory changes. Media coverage and online commentary focused on the preventability of the death. Friends and witnesses described Hales as intelligent, determined, and obsessed with digital validation. He had the education, the equipment, and the information to choose a safe course, and he was sober. Multiple human warnings and mechanical warnings were present and ignored. Investigators concluded this was catastrophic judgment, not equipment failure, and the death was entirely preventable. It was January 10, 2022, when Tanya K. Moreno, age 29, began a live stream from her Sacramento apartment announcing her intent to complete an extreme internet challenge. Moreno was a full-time content creator, employed full-time, with no history of substance abuse or mental illness. She was sober at the time and had spent days promoting the event to her 38,000 followers. Colleagues and friends described her as ambitious, attention-oriented, and persuasive. On camera, she appeared composed and articulate, a functional adult seeking views and validation, a clear motivation for the planned act. Medical advisories about the challenge had circulated widely the month before, and several previous deaths had been headline news. During the 2-hour broadcast, friends and viewers repeatedly posted warnings in the chat, citing known risks and urging her to stop. A friend sent a direct message offering to call emergency services. Moreno dismissed each message, insisting she had researched the effects and could handle it. Witnesses on the stream documented their concern, escalating from caution to alarm. The warnings were explicit and numerous, a string of preventable opportunities that were ignored. The challenge required rapid consumption of a hazardous quantity of a household substance, far exceeding any published safety guidelines. Moreno measured out the dose on camera while referencing online forums and prior viral videos, demonstrating the exact volume she intended to ingest. At 8:17 p.m., she began the intake, and she ignored the direct message offering emergency assistance. Within 20 minutes, her speech slurred and visible tremors developed. At 8:39 p.m., she suffered the first of several tonic-clonic seizures, and consciousness was lost as her body attempted to expel the toxin. The physiological cascade unfolded rapidly. An acute electrolyte imbalance was produced, which precipitated cardiac arrhythmia, then progressive multi-organ failure. Paramedics arrived at 8:55 p.m. Resuscitation efforts were performed, and Moreno was pronounced dead at 8:57 p.m., cause of death recorded as cardiac arrest, secondary to acute toxicity. The timeline was tight and clinical, a clear sequence from ingestion to systemic collapse, demonstrating that the outcome was both rapid and predictable under known toxicology principles. The clinical course was lethal and unambiguous. The coroner's report documented lethal plasma concentrations of the ingested substance and organ damage consistent with an overwhelming systemic response. Investigators reviewed the complete digital trail, including forum posts, private messages, and the full live stream archive, confirming that Moreno had researched the risks in advance and had actively dismissed both public health warnings and real-time pleas from viewers. The investigation emphasized preventability, noting multiple explicit intervention points that were not taken. The case prompted renewed calls from medical professionals for stricter content moderation and digital platform accountability. The death was cited in toxicology seminars as an example of the lethal intersection of online validation and willful disregard for medical fact. The outcome was judged to be a direct result of catastrophic judgment, not impairment, and it became a cautionary reference in public health discussions. It was July 9, 2018 when Samuel P. Ortega, 36 years old, arrived in Pamplona, Spain as one of thousands of tourists drawn to the annual running of the bulls. Ortega was a management consultant from Dallas, physically fit, and otherwise fully functional. He described himself on social media as an adrenaline collector. He had no prior experience with livestock or Spanish festivals, and he had resources and capacity to follow basic safety guidance. Pamplona authorities had briefed participants that morning: no distractions, no photography, and strict barriers separating runners from spectators. 4-foot steel rails lined the course, with uniformed officials posted every 50 meters. Ortega's friends, also tourists, warned him repeatedly not to cross the barrier. Local volunteers echoed the warnings and pointed to posted signs in Spanish and English that read, "No entry, risk of serious injury or death." But as the herd thundered down Estafeta Street at 15 miles per hour, at 8:01 a.m., Ortega ignored the warnings. He vaulted the barrier, phone in hand, and positioned himself in the direct path of the bulls to frame a selfie. Witnesses later recalled his focus on the screen, oblivious to pounding hooves and shouts from bystanders. The lead bull, weighing 1,300 pounds, altered course by less than 1 meter, making contact. He was gored through the left thigh and thrown to the cobblestones, then trampled by 2 additional animals. The initial impact produced a deep puncture wound and a fractured femur. Subsequent trampling produced blunt force trauma to the chest and abdomen. Emergency medical technicians reached him within 3 minutes. His injuries included severe internal hemorrhage and multiple rib fractures. He lost consciousness en route to the hospital, and he was pronounced dead 11 minutes after the incident. The municipal investigation reviewed crowd control footage and multiple bystander videos. All confirmed Ortega had crossed the barrier deliberately, despite 4 separate warnings in the preceding hour. No substances were detected in his system. The official report cited willful disregard for posted safety protocols and verbal warnings, and classified the death as preventable. Local officials expressed frustration that event safety measures had been circumvented by a single act of personal vanity. Media coverage in Spain and the United States emphasized the absurdity of risking life for a photograph. Pamplona City Council reaffirmed its ban on in-race photography and increased signage for future events. Ortega's death remains a reference in festival safety briefings, a stark example of social image taking precedence over self-preservation, with fatal consequences witnessed by thousands. It was April 14, 2020 when Harold J. Fenwick, age 58, wheeled his riding lawnmower from the garage of his Dayton, Ohio home. Fenwick was a retired mechanical engineer, described by neighbors as meticulous, confident, and practical. He was physically fit for his age, sober, and fully alert. The motive was convenience, a desire to complete the job in a single pass rather than fetch the proper tools. The proper hedge trimmers hung in plain sight on a wall hook inside his garage, yet Fenwick chose a makeshift approach that was preventable from the start. At 11:17 a.m., Fenwick started the mower and began to climb the plywood ramp he had constructed at the base of a 15-foot hedge. The ramp flexed under the weight of the 600-pound mower, but he pressed forward, ignoring a shouted warning from the neighbor across the fence. Friends and his wife had questioned the plan, pointing to the visible instability and the risk of driving a heavy machine onto a 3-to-1 slope. As the mower reached the midpoint, the incline increased to 27 degrees, well beyond the manufacturer's recommended operating angle, and the machine's center of gravity shifted abruptly. The change in balance triggered a rapid cascade of motion that led to an unavoidable tip. But as the mower tipped, it rolled off the ramp and trapped Fenwick's left thigh beneath the chassis. The rotating cutting deck contacted the upper leg and inflicted a deep laceration with immediate severance of the femoral artery. Advanced clinical description recorded transection of the femoral artery with massive hemorrhage and soft tissue destruction consistent with direct blade trauma. Fenwick remained conscious for several minutes, calling out for help as blood pooled beneath the mower. His wife dialed 911 at 11:19 a.m., and emergency medical services arrived within 6 minutes. Despite rapid extrication attempts, control of hemorrhage, and advanced life support measures, Fenwick was pronounced dead at 11:25 a.m. from exsanguination secondary to femoral artery transection. The coroner's report characterized the injury as immediately life-threatening, with irreversible hemorrhagic shock occurring within 8 minutes of the initial trauma. The clinical timeline was clear and unambiguous, exsanguination documented as the mechanism of death. The subsequent investigation found no mechanical defects in the mower or the ramp. Witness interviews confirmed that Fenwick had received 2 explicit warnings in the hour before the incident, and that proper hedge trimmers were available in the garage, demonstrating the complete unnecessity of the chosen method. Safety experts later used the case in equipment misuse seminars to illustrate the dangers of convenience-driven shortcuts and the absolute preventability of the outcome. Neighbors and colleagues expressed disbelief that a trained engineer would disregard basic physics and common sense, and the incident became a reference point in household safety literature and community training for years to follow. It was September 21, 2017, when Elliot F. Gardner, age 45, stood in a fallow field outside Amarillo, Texas, with a borrowed ballistic vest strapped to his chest. Gardner was a successful logistics consultant, sober, without history of substance use or mental illness. He was confident, methodical, and prone to theatrical proofs. The vest had been borrowed for a live demonstration intended to settle an argument he had been having in text messages. In the days before the event, Gardner exchanged texts with his friend and accomplice Daniel Reeves. The conversation showed Gardner dismissing safer alternatives, including the use of a ballistics gel dummy, and ignoring links to standardized testing protocols. Reeves repeatedly expressed hesitation, raising concerns about the vest's age and the lack of professional supervision. Gardner responded with bravado and insisted that it was time to settle the debate. The attempt was planned, and the warnings were explicit. At 4:13 p.m., after a series of phone-filmed rehearsals, Gardner positioned himself 20 yards from Reeves, who held a .45 caliber handgun. The vest was secured, but the label's faded print made its protection level uncertain, and the panel appeared compromised. Reeves voiced one last objection. Gardner waved him off and gave the signal. The single round struck Gardner's thoracic region at close range. The projectile penetrated the compromised panel, entered the left side of his chest, and severed the pulmonary artery. Gardner collapsed instantly. External hemorrhage was visible within seconds. Loss of consciousness occurred within 1 minute as blood pooled in the left pleural cavity, producing rapid hypovolemic shock. Cardiac output fell precipitously and respiratory function failed. Death was pronounced at 4:16 p.m., less than 3 minutes after impact. Emergency services arrived at 4:21 p.m., by which time all vital signs had ceased. The medical sequence was catastrophic and rapid. The investigation recovered text messages, video footage, and the vest itself. The medical examiner documented a single gunshot wound with catastrophic internal hemorrhage and noted that the vest's rating had expired years before. The report stated that the death was entirely preventable, highlighting Gardner's rejection of standard safety procedures and the multiple warnings from his accomplice. Reeves appeared visibly shaken in the footage and was later charged with reckless endangerment and negligent homicide. Legal filings referenced the documented planning and the explicit disregard for safer alternatives. Firearms safety experts reviewed the evidence and pointed to standardized testing methods that had been available and ignored. Media coverage described the incident as a case study in fatal hubris. Commentators expressed disbelief that an otherwise capable adult would choose a method so obviously lethal, particularly when non-lethal options were readily available. The case left a legacy as a cautionary tale. The investigation concluded that the root cause was catastrophic judgment, not equipment failure alone. Gardner's death stood as an apex example of deliberate risk-taking and the fatal consequences of ignoring expert guidance and basic common sense. Across all 7 cases, one truth was undeniable. Catastrophic outcomes often resulted not from ignorance, but from the deliberate rejection of common sense. Each incident exposed how overconfidence and the dismissal of repeated warnings had overridden even basic survival instincts. In an age saturated with information, these deaths proved that human folly remained a potent force. Sometimes the most dangerous risk was believing they were the exception.